afternoon, everyone, and thank you very much for signing up to this 1-hour webinar. The topic is very much top of mind right now because obviously everybody's concerned about stakeholders and their impact before, during, and after a crisis. And so it used to always be the case, but I think today with social media bringing stakeholders much closer to home, it is something that really needs to be taken into account. It is a skill to map stakeholders. It's not something that you just do on the fly. It's more than making just lists. And I hope that this session very much helps you understand how that can be done. There are a number of tools and ways and processes to do this very effectively. We've been in crisis management, risk, and business continuity for 30 years. We are 100% focused on these three topics, and we work globally with multinational companies or large international organizations, as well as NGOs and industry associations, in helping them build resilience. I've been in crisis management for just about around that time, since I'm the founding partner, and started my career in this field with a major plane crash, actually, handling a major plane crash. So I have, unfortunately, some pretty dramatic experience to start with. And this is what made me decide to focus on this topic for the rest of my professional life. We from the beginning were very much focused on stakeholders, both internal and stakeholders and external, as they are a critical variable of being able to lead through a crisis and basically also try to come out on the other side in one piece, so to speak. So let me get started. The idea here is that when you manage crisis, it's not just response. It's really prevention and anticipation. It is interesting to look at the fact that the majority of crises in the developed world are actually smoldering crises. They start small, they kind of get attention, and they may kind of simmer under the surface for a while until there's a trigger that makes them obviously known to everyone and go into the public eye. So the bulk of the work, if the majority of crises are smoldering, then the bulk of the work really needs to be done up front. I understand quite a few of you are in safety and health and safety, and obviously processes, prevention, mitigation are top of mind. It's the same very much in crisis prevention and in terms of building crisis resilience. Once this is in place, it has to be integrated with the crisis preparedness or crisis readiness phase, as well as the business continuity and disaster management. The idea is that with every critical risk listed in your critical crisis register should be a designated and articulated business continuity plan. In the middle, what you do during the loss and the management of the loss is really considered emergency response and crisis management. And a big variable, as I was saying, are stakeholders in a crisis. You can't influence all stakeholders. They have huge bearings on the way a crisis is perceived, and you can't always control it all. And so that is the very nature of crisis.
Caroline, I'm just going to interrupt. I think at the moment we can just see the first slide, but I think you might be on slide 4 at the moment on your screen. Is that correct?
Yeah.
And is it in slideshow?
Yes.
Mode? Yeah. Okay. Perhaps are you happy for me to share from my screen and then you instruct me?
Yes.
Because it appears to be stuck. Okay, bear with me one moment. Sorry about this, folks. Let me just set this up.
Okay. So, all right, great. Thank you for that, and apologies about the interruption. Yeah, we advocate an integrated approach to business and crisis resilience, the before, the during, and the after. Before is very, very important because the majority of crises, as I said a couple minutes ago, are smoldering. So there is a chance to actually anticipate and mitigate before they kind of blow up in your face. And the post-loss is equally important in the sense of that's where you take the learnings from, that's where you establish and enhance your preparation and prevention capability. All through all these pillars, which really need to be integrated, is the big topic of stakeholder management and how do you communicate and engage with stakeholders in the middle of crisis under pressure. So let me go through this one by one. So Holly, if you could move to the next slide, please, that would be great.
There we go.
Thanks. In today's world, public outrage actually drives crises, and you can see it. We can see it in Ottawa and what's going on now. We can see it in multiple channels, face-to-face, virtual. There's an incredible power of public outrage on crises. They sometimes create crises, or if they don't create it, they definitely amplify the crisis. And the big topics right now are any form of discrimination, race, religion, creed, gender, etc., migration, human rights, slavery, child labor, gender inequality, sexual harassment, big data, privacy, treatment of animals, the whole environmental space with the planet and climate change, food safety and food security, which are very different, and companies that are very well known, or big brands that are very well known, and they're very easily targeted when something goes wrong, and they take kind of the brunt of the attacks. And there can be others. So the point about public outrage is that it is something to really take into account when try to map strategies and action plan either before, during, or after a crisis. Next slide, please. Thank you. So crises get worse before they get better. Now, it's always been the case, probably now with COVID, everybody's kind of come to grips with that concept. It is a fact that crises tend to get worse before they get better, inevitably. Sometimes it's just a couple of days, sometimes it's a few weeks, sometimes it's a few months, and sometimes it's a few years, like COVID. And the human psyche is not very well equipped for this ongoing uncertainty that crises prevent. Because in order to adapt and in order to adjust, we hope for the best. But in fact, at the crisis team levels and the response teams level, we really need to reverse this. We really need to think of preparing for the worst and then hoping for the best. Preparing for the worst because it makes a lot of business sense and made a lot of sense in terms of resilience. Hoping for the best is the emotional intelligence and emotional drive that you can continue to give your teams whilst at the same time being ready for the worst, because that's what you need to do. So with that in mind, if we can move on to the next slide, we need to look at the characteristics and phase of crises. So something happens, it could be something that's been going on for a while, but something gets revealed. And what you can think of as mega crises that have had the smoldering characteristics and blew up to huge proportion. One is a great example is the Volkswagen emissions scandal. It's been going on, it was going on for a little while. Something got revealed and obviously it went into a crisis. It's interesting to think that it's the revelation that caused the crisis. There were no deaths. There were no wrongdoing, or there was no accident. There was a lot of wrongdoing, but it was hidden, and it's the revelation that caused the crisis. So it peaks, and then it starts to drop attention as the resolution, the media attention slows down through the investigative phase, but it can peak again depending on whether the crisis gets resolved or it carries on. And the news cycle, which obviously makes it become old news. So the fact is, you can't apply one size fits all. They do fit a pattern crises, but you need to customize and build your strategy around the specifics of each crisis. No two crises are the same, even if they follow a certain pattern. The fact is, if you are prepared, you have a chance at really steering the course and coming out of it in one piece, as opposed to completely shattered and letting it last 2.5 times longer. Okay, so carrying on. We have advocated the PAIR principle for many years. This principle is CS&A's principles, an acronym that helps corporations and teams and companies and organizations really focus on what matters in a crisis. This is it's the foundation for good crisis leadership priorities. The first thing is people. People always come first. Second is environment. Third is assets. And if you do it in that order, you then have a chance of protecting your reputation. There are many examples of companies who seem to have prioritized assets over everything else, and we know very well what happened to their reputation. So with that foundation, let's take a look at the next slide. And we have articulated 8 core crisis leadership competencies that we've applied across industries. The first one is to take stock of what's happening, assess risks and threats. It's called situational awareness. The second one is how to organize the team and allocate resources based on that initial situational awareness. The establishment of a pattern of team communication so that it is structured, organized, and not left to debate or consensus building. Crisis leadership calls for a more command and control type of decision making. Then we have sense making, which is how do we give purpose in the middle of chaos? Crisis decision making, which is not the same as normal decision making, because obviously we don't have the same amount of time, we don't have enough information very often, or too much conflicting information. And then you go into 2 areas which are really core and need to be required that crisis teams or whoever handles a crisis be trained in. One is stakeholder mapping, and very closely connected to that is scenario planning. And of course, then you have crisis communication with internal and external stakeholders. So moving from that, let's take a look at why stakeholders are so important. So imagine you've just been told that something's happened and you gather the team together to try and manage the situation. If the crisis is protracted, it lasts for a few days, weeks, or months, what happens is that the team starts to get a little bit of a navel gazing approach. And that internal view of the situation by the organization and the team managing it tends to be inward focused because of fatigue, because we know that we're doing a lot and we don't have time to consider other things. However, if the external perceptual view of the situation by stakeholders, whether internal or external stakeholders to the organization, is absolutely critical in the way the crisis is going to path or the way the crisis is going to evolve in. And if those 2 views are not matching, and if they're far apart, you end up with what we call a reputation train wreck. So it is absolutely critical for these 2 perceptions to actually be as close as possible to what is really the reality. External perceptual view are normal, and fighting them is not the solution. We have to accept that stakeholders have certain perceptions. The intention here is to say, okay, you have this perception. How do I correct your perceptions? How do I make sure that our perception, which is close to the fact, is perceived as such? This is the basis of stakeholder mapping. So moving to the next slide, what is stakeholder mapping? It's the ability to identify and map relevant internal and external stakeholders. It helps to articulate an effective management and communication strategy that maintains consistent and well-understood messages. It recognizes the impact of effective stakeholder engagement on reputation in a crisis. And it understands and applies the practice of advocacy with external regulators, NGOs, and other external bodies. So you see the image here. That's what we get in a crisis. We get a web of stakeholders. Not all these stakeholders are actually aligned. So we find ourselves in a crisis very often navigating conflicting agendas among our stakeholders. So how do you satisfy one without upsetting the other? It's impossible. So you have to set a course, hold the course, that's your strategy, that's your mission statement, and recognize where do you actually have influence, and try to get caught, not to get caught in that web of stakeholders. And this is a big challenge. So when we talk about regulators and government, I've handled multiple crises where one side of regulators says something and the other says something else. And it's often impacted either by political agendas, elections, all sorts of other things that come and influence government and institutions who are and should be neutral, but cannot be neutral. If you try to influence that in the middle of a crisis, you're never going to succeed. If we look at COVID, look at the multiplicity of advice and conflicting information that was given by different governments, different parts in each government, and everybody ended up doing their own thing. So I think recognizing who's out there and how they play out onto the crisis, what influence they have onto the crisis, is step number one. So what do we mean by actually mapping stakeholders? If we can go to the next slide. Who are they? First of all, go to granular details. Don't just say government department or media. That's useless. There are multiple media with multiple political leanings, multiple types of media, from print to broadcast to internet to all sorts of different things. And so it is important to actually list in as many details and individuality as possible. Second question is, do they have a conflicting agenda? And that's a question that you need to keep asking yourselves as you add stakeholders to the map and as the situation evolves. I remember years ago working for an oil and gas company in a Latin American country where the president was obviously charting a specific course for oil and gas in that country. And the company involved was trying to find a new way of dealing and obviously protecting their business in that environment. And we started mapping stakeholders. And at the end of the day, they actually realized that there was no point to map all the different entities in that country, that the only one who really mattered was the presidential office. And so they focused 100% all their efforts on a strategy to deal with the president. And that was where they saved their effort and where they focused with great success, actually. The next question is, what are the possible impact and possible reactions to communication? So if you make a decision, can you map out how your critical stakeholders are going to perceive that decision and therefore react to the decision? And is that reaction likely to make the situation worse? So it's not just let's map, let's list, oh, this guy is here, this group is there. It's really going down quite further in detail. So if I'm going to make that decision, it's a small risk analysis of the possible reactions of key stakeholders on what you're about to do and what you're about to say. Do you also understand their position, their perceptions? And if you don't, it's worth kind of reflecting on that. You can't make assumptions in a crisis because your best friend in peacetime may actually turn against you in crisis. The most obvious example is if you're an organization and you're building a new plant in a town where you're going to offer lots of employment to local people, you're going to be the mayor's best friend. If that plant is built and 2 years later, that plant has a major fire or an explosion, the mayor is going to be your worst enemy because he doesn't care about you. The only thing he cares about are his constituents. So beware of where the positions are, and they can shift. Who's on your side, who's against you, who can you rely on, and who's neutral? And if they're neutral, what could make them shift and go against you? Based on that, you focus. Let me say that if you're an oil and gas company, there is no point in trying to influence Greenpeace if you have an oil spill. You're wasting your time. Just monitor what they're doing and focus on where you can have an impact. What are your key messages based on this map? What are you going to say? What would you like your stakeholders to say about you when you're on the other side of the crisis? So for an image, imagine that a crisis is a big dark tunnel. You don't know how long the tunnel is. You don't know how many bends. You don't know if anything's coming at you and you can't see anything. That's the uncertainty which crises are riddled with. So you set your course, You don't know what's going to happen. The only thing you know, because you've been in tunnels before, is that there is light at the end. There is an exit, or at least you hope so. So when you come out of that tunnel and you come out and you've got all your stakeholders kind of looking at you as you come out. And if you're in one piece with a few scratches and bruises, they will say, okay, fine, you had some troubles, but you sustained your credibility with what you did. You walk the talk and talk the walk. If you're all broken up and your stakeholders turn against you, you got a bigger problem. Then that's a reputation meltdown. And it's much harder to survive and recover from a reputation meltdown than from a crisis. They're not the same. And so based on that, you need to assess what your key messages, what you would like your stakeholders to say about you at the end of the crisis, and what the expected results are. So moving on to the next one. Why is stakeholder mapping and worst case scenario development so closely connected? Because worst case scenarios really can materialize in 4 different ways. The situation itself gets worse. You've got a fire, the fire gets worse. The impact of the situation worsens. So the fire is out. There were 3 people in the hospital. 3 days later, 2 of the 3 die. So you now have fatalities, even though your fire is out. 3 is stakeholders increasing pressure through a range of actions because they feel or see or perceive that you haven't quite behaved in a credible way that they can give you a second chance, or they want something from you. So the increased pressure can come in any number of ways. If it's internal, it can be strikes. If it could be exposure through media, it could be legal action. It could be lobbying for change of legislation. It could be a number of things. The 4th way in which the situation can get worse is if you're slow off the mark, if you're complacent, if your decisions and indecisions actually make the situation worse. So worst case scenario planning is an incredible tool in a crisis, especially when you got a lot of uncertainty and people are feeling powerless. So what's happening is that you react to developments. But crises are made of peaks and valleys. In the valleys, you need to keep the team going and focused on something positive. If during the valleys you anticipate worst case scenarios and you build strategies for these possible scenarios, you're doing 2 things. You're keeping the team focused on something useful and you're prepared for the next wave. Remember, crises get worse before they get better. So it's an incredibly useful tool. So you can look at the fire and see how ways that the fire could get worse. But you can also start looking at your stakeholder map and by anticipating possible actions they can take against you, you're also developing worst case scenarios. Because your crisis could be over, you may have had no fatality, everything actually was resolved fairly easily, but then, especially in investigation, certain things get revealed and your stakeholders start taking action against you and increase the pressure. So you got a worsening situation. The event is over, the crisis lingers. And the crisis actually at that time is much harder to handle in terms of the impact on the overall organization. So moving on to the next slide, let's do a little practice. So here I'm going to invite you to look at this simple situation and put your comments based on these 3 questions in the chat box so we can get some insight from everyone and try to have a little bit of a conversation. The situation is that you have a retired employee who's given an interview to a local radio station claiming serious safety gaps at some of your production facilities. So try to list anywhere between 3 and 5 top stakeholders in the chat box. Start with that.
And as a reminder to everyone, if you go to the question symbol on your right-hand side toolbar, that's where you can share your thoughts with us.
So do we have any thoughts on stakeholders?
We haven't got any through as of yet, but I'm sure people are busy typing away. We have had a question, but I'll come to that at the end, Caroline.
Okay. So we got a couple minutes, just, give any input that you want. Top of mind, who are your key stakeholders? A lot of you, I understand, are in health and safety, so I would imagine coming up with stakeholders is not too difficult.
Okay, we haven't got anything come through as of yet, so perhaps we can go through the other questions and then it might allow some time for people to type their responses.
All right, so maybe let's take the first question, and I welcome anybody to add to this. Stakeholders are obviously the company itself, because the employee is a retired employee from that company. So the number one stakeholder is the company in question. Number two stakeholders would be regulators. Number three stakeholders could be employees. Number four stakeholders could be investors or shareholders. As an example, those are the ones that would be there. Then you have to try and figure out who's on your side, who's against you, who's neutral. You hope that your employees would be on your side. The regulators are definitely need to be neutral and remain neutral because that is their mandate. Who's against you? Anybody that has had potentially any bad experience among the employees, or anybody who's been a victim of any safety gap, for example, an accident. So in the employees, there's a good example where you have to kind of identify out anybody that has had a negative safety experience within that company.
We've had some comments through now. So we've got Robert, who has shared community, service providers and employees. Elroy has suggested employees, owners, shareholders and the public. And Simon has suggested employees, shareholders, clients, contractors, suppliers, banks and trade bodies.
Okay, very good. Well done. So all these are very relevant. Now, when you map, you list all of them, and then you have to start asking the questions that were on the previous slide. And for instance, what is their issue? So clearly, if you've got an employee that in the past 5 years was the victim of some sort of an accident, his perceptions are very, very personal because he has been impacted by the so-called safety gaps that are claimed by this retired employee. What's his perception? Hugely negative. On the other hand, you may have the community who generally feels that this is a good employer, that they keep the plant very much aligned with the community, and so they are neutral, and they're probably on your side because actually the plant has given employment to quite a lot of people in the town, and so on and so forth. So you need to start looking who's on your side, who's against you, and who's neutral. And the ones who are against you is where you start drawing possible scenario escalations. So if you've identified, for example, that an employee has suffered an accident because of so-called safety gaps, what could he do that would escalate the situation? I invite you to put in some ideas in the chat box.
Christopher has shared some further responses to the first point. So who are your stakeholders? And some of these we've covered already, but I'll just read out what he's shared. So he said employees, clients, local communities, supply chain, customers, enforcement agencies, and also the media.
Yeah. Okay, very good. All these are very relevant. I think there will come a point when you start listing where you have to prioritize. And you prioritize by when you ask the second question, which is who's against you. So the ones that are likely against you are the ones that likely could take actions, and they always have to migrate to the top because they deserve most attention. The second question is, of course, can you influence any of it? is there anything you can do to neutralize that? If you can't, you have to monitor. If you can, you then build a strategy. Often the strategy is supported by communication to that particular stakeholder, and so on and so forth. This is how you actually prioritize and build a strategy around stakeholders and stakeholder mapping, and also how you build worst case scenarios. So one of the interesting things is that a lot of organizations we've spoken to over the years said, oh yeah, we do stakeholder mapping. We put a Boston matrix and we put them here and there. Yeah, that's fine. We map them. Maybe. Most of the time, it's a list. And then somebody goes out and talks to them without any sort of risk or strategic reflection on the best way to approach this particular stakeholder, or even not to approach this particular stakeholder. So the stakeholder mapping that I'm talking about is far more detailed, and therefore it requires a little bit of training. And we recommend that on emergency and crisis teams, at least 2 people be trained in this task, so that they can do that as an ongoing basis, and they become part of the thinking group on the team. So if you imagine you got a team, you have doers, thinkers, and support. They go into the thinkers bucket because they are the ones who are extracting themselves from direct decision making and the crux of what's going on. And what they're doing is they're using the peace of mind to actually strategize and think about these stakeholders and report that information back to the team for better decision making and anticipation. So this is where the power is, and it is more than just making lists. So you can see that from identification, you then assess position, perceptions, allies, neutrals, enemies, and then from that you can try and determine where do you have an influence, and if these that are against you, if they would take action, what could you do? Is there anything you can do to neutralize? And then you move on and you move down that path. The ones where you have no influence, remember, save your breath. You don't have the time to start influencing people in the middle of a crisis. A very good example of how not to do it was the Boeing accident in the 737. The relationship between the Boeing engineers and the FDA is almost incestuous, to the sense that a lot of the FDA assessors are actually ex-Boeing employees. So they were cozy, a little bit too cozy with the regulator. And so the regulator really had a big problem, because the accident was Boeing, but it highlighted that the regulator were not doing their jobs. And in fact, they were a little bit in the pocket of Boeing. And it took a new FDA director and a new CEO to shift that relationship, so that the regulator does what a regulator should do, and the company works with the regulator, but is not influencing in ways that is actually counterproductive, which is exactly what happened. Any other points raised in the question box?
Yes, there have been. So Elroy, in response to question 3, he said the employee affected by the claims of serious safety gaps in the production facility may seek legal action against the company. In addition to the impact on the company's finances, this approach will expose the company to reputational damage, which in most cases is harder to quantify. And Robert has added, in a unionised environment, the union can be one of the stakeholders who are against you, depending on the working environment.
Absolutely, and this is where the context is important. What kind of unions? Is it only one union? Is it more than one? What is their affiliation? How close is one to management versus the other? What is their labor environment? Absolutely, and rule playbook in that particular country. So all these things have a huge impact, but you can tell just from that it's not a quick fix. That it's not to say, oh, well, let's list the unions. That's not enough. Who and where in the union? And which union? and who is managing what and how, what is their position. So go down to details as necessary. Don't just go into the generic group categories of stakeholders. All right, so moving on. I want to show you here actually that there is a tool, it's a tool that we've developed, but there are real tools to map stakeholders that you can onboard and take on yourself as a software. It's gonna really fast track this whole process incredibly and put out and flag things to you that you would take much longer to actually put yourself, do by yourself manually. So I recommend looking into that, and if you want information, please let me know. We called it Untangle exactly because it is that. It is trying to untangle a maze to see some clarity and have some sort of strategy in the middle of chaos. Okay, moving on. And there is the difference between a crisis and a reputation train wreck. It all lies with stakeholders. So the situation could be the same on both sides. You got severe impact, disruption. It can be difficult to resolve. It can last a long time. But by owning up to the problem, walking the talk, being credible, honest, and maintaining integrity, you actually retain stakeholder trust. From a stakeholder trust basis, you can enhance reputation and certainly recover much faster from a major crisis. On the other side, if you have slow response, empty talk, denial, deceptiveness, or actually wrong prioritizing, for instance, assets over other things, you do destroy stakeholder trust. And recovering for that is incredibly difficult. People, by and large, stakeholders are willing to give a second chance to an organization if they feel they have been treated credibly and with respect. When they are ignored, dismissed, when there's denial, when there's empty talk, when there's not enough information, that stakeholder trust gets really shattered and it's much harder, and you end up in a reputation train wreck or meltdown, whichever word you prefer. All right, so I think we have some time for questions.
Yes, that's correct. So we have had a question asked already, and this is from Elroy. So I'll read that out. Elroy has asked, the media is specially poised to provide key information to the public during a crisis. During the COVID-19 pandemic, the media has changed its position, often taking conflict stances every few months. What is the way forward for the media coming out of the COVID-19 pandemic?
Okay, I think it's a great question. I know the media quite well because I actually started my career in communication. And it is important not to look at the media as one group. Unfortunately, there are multiple groups of different news media, both from the channels that they use, but also from their credibility. And there's umpteen surveys that shows that trust in all information sources is significantly down since COVID-19. But interestingly, readership of top quality newspapers is up. Subscriptions are up for the top quality newspapers. We're talking The Guardian, The Times, Le Monde in France, Corriere della Sera in Italy, obviously the Washington Post. Those, and it's not necessarily political affiliation. It's really more about the amount of research that different medias will do. The media's job, by and large, is to pass on information. But it is not information. There are news stories. Stories need a header, a lead paragraph, a body, a conclusion. If it doesn't have that, it doesn't get read, it doesn't get watched. So basically, it's not pure information. So you really have to focus on the ones that are doing their job in investigating, getting the right sources, and publishing the information in accurate as possible. I think the media, like many of us, have also become victims of the conflicting information that came out of ministries of health, international health bodies like the WHO, the CDC, the ECDC, etc., etc. And I think the media were just as confused as everybody else. There was no one voice. And I think a little bit of discerning, a little bit of discrimination between all this is very helpful. I do think that the media do a good job in our society. Thank God we have a certain amount of free speech in our environments, but we have to recognize where is it manipulated. For instance, very few people know that in the US, Fox News is not a news organization. It's an entertainment body. It doesn't fall under the same regulation as real news organizations. So everybody is screaming that Fox News, which I despise, is peddling in misinformation. Is absolutely true, but they don't fall under the broadcast and news regulation. So they're free to do a lot more things than a New York Times or an ABC or a BBC would do for sure. So I think you have to be a bit more discerning in terms of relying on media, working with media in a crisis. My feeling is that in general, credibility goes a long way, authenticity goes a long way with media, and I think that goes with every other stakeholder as well. So it's a long answer, but it's an important topic.
Definitely. Thank you for that question, Elroy. And just a reminder, if anybody else has any other questions, then click on the question icon on your toolbar on the right-hand side and you'll be able to ask those there. In the meantime, I have a few questions. So the first one is, why is stakeholder mapping such an important crisis leadership skill?
So in the old days, and I can kind of speak to that because I started crisis management before, just when CNN came on the scene. So when there was 24/7 cable news. And that was already in itself a huge change. In the old days, you could say that you had different groups of stakeholders, but the channels were more straightforward in terms of reaching those stakeholders and having some sort of an impact. The problem today is that with social media, this information is no longer filtered. And so anybody can take that information and manipulate it in any direction without any sort of verification. So you have the fact checkers. On top of that, you have deep fakes, which is another horrible thing. So why has it become so important? Because in the old days, you could say, well, my comms department is going to handle that. Today, it's the responsibility of every member on the crisis team and leadership team to be mindful that actually stakeholder and stakeholder trust is the only thing that needs to be retained in a crisis. The rest is nice add-ons, and it starts from the top. So leaders absolutely must be trained, must be aware of stakeholder mapping to protect their organization trust, the trust in their organization.
And the next one, who is best suited to map and engage stakeholders in a crisis?
Actually, a lot of the general, it kind of goes with what I was saying before. The general perception is that here, let's pass it on to comms, the comms department, they'll know how to do it. I think that's a mistake. I think every crisis team, every leadership team in action that's managing a serious issue or a burning crisis or a smoldering crisis needs to have one or two designated team members that does stakeholder mapping and worst case scenario planning. It can no longer just be passed on to comms because the impact is too great, and senior leaders really need to be made aware of what the impact can be.
Okay, and how is it best to train those who are responsible for undertaking that stakeholder analysis? Is this something they can be trained in?
Yeah, so I think there's two levels here. I think senior leaders, we don't like to talk about training too much. That's not usually very well received, but sort of workshops, awareness sessions, and excellence, reflection, strategic sessions that really show the impact of good stakeholder mapping on business in general, on managing issues, and on protecting the organization through adversity and crises, absolutely. At a slightly lower level, so the sort of maybe tactical or operations level, if employing a tool like Entangle, all these people need is a 1 hour training on how to use it so that they can actually roll with it when something happens. And we've had multiple examples of that among our clients who actually set up internal teams of stakeholder mappers. And in ongoing crises and burning crises, actually, there's people got together in the organization and banged out these stakeholder maps that they could take to the leadership team and say, hey guys, this is what we need to pay attention to, this is what we need to look at, and it became really strategic advisors for the top team.
Okay. We've had a question come through from Robert, who has asked, is it advisable to set boundaries or limitations for stakeholders depending on how they respond during a crisis?
Boundaries, I'm not quite sure.
We might need a little bit more information on that one, Robert, so we can answer that properly for you, but I'm sure I can put you in touch with Caroline after the session today. If you're not able to get that to us now. And then this is another one related to COVID-19. It's asking for your opinion on the censorship of so-called misinformation. Do you think this has been counterintuitive during the COVID-19 pandemic?
Yes, imagine that everybody's asking that question. I think the word censoring is flagging things for me, because we are in a hopefully democratic free speech environment, at least most of us are, where those things are regulated. Regulated because the idea is that you don't smear. There is libel. You don't smear someone. You cannot have defamation. You cannot publish inaccurate information because you get sued. So if you're going to get sued and it results in a code of conduct, I don't think censorship is the right thing. There is always some censorship, but we have to be careful that we don't fall in the trap of over censoring under the label of let's limit fake news, because censoring is a very dangerous thing to do, and it doesn't quite echo with our values. So I think it's more of a question of accuracy that we should look at, fact-based information versus perceptions, manipulation. I think fact-based is really the underlying guide to what gets published and what doesn't get published. And if it's opinion-based, it should be labeled as opinion. That's why you have opinion piece in newspapers. And if people want to express an opinion on social networks, fine. But that is not necessarily fact-based. It is dangerous, but it's not fact-based.
Caroline, that's all the questions we have for now. I've popped the next slide up on the screen if you'd like to talk through that.
So one of the things that we did with IRSM, which has been great, is that we certified all our e-learning courses, and they're available in multiple languages since this actually screenshot from the IRSM website. And we have 3 fundamental courses. Part 1, which is the basics of crisis management. Part 2 is all about leadership and includes stakeholder mapping and scenario planning. And part 3 is crisis communication. The idea is that these courses can be completely customized to be put on companies' LMS, so they run it themselves so that people are trained. The reason for these courses is not so much that they replace the in-person training or online training, is that they complement it, because one of the complaints we had over and over again is that we have so many teams, we can't possibly have consultants and trainers just going from place to place and training so many teams. What can we provide with today's technology that complements the in-person or virtual training get? And that's when in 2017, way before COVID, we already rolled out these courses. And they've been very well received, and they can be completely customized to the client's environment. So that's a little bit of a plug for us. But since we are running this with IRSM, I wanted to say that they are IRSM certified. You get a certificate for them. And if anybody's interested, just to get in touch with me.
Yep, sure. And your LinkedIn contact details are below, and also from the handout section on your toolbar on the right hand side, you can download a copy of these slides, and again, Caroline's contact details are there for you should you have any further questions that you'd like to ask her. So Caroline, thank you so much for sharing your knowledge and your experience with us today. It was really insightful. Thank you to everyone who joined and for your questions and comments also. Enjoy the rest of your day, and goodbye.
Thank you very much, Holly and IRSM. Thank you all very much for attending this session, and get in touch if you want to know more or if you have other questions.
Thank you, Caroline.
Thank
Goodbye.
you. Bye-bye.